Two possibilities. That was all investigators had. Either Lauren and Nicole had walked away by choice, or someone had taken that choice from them. In the early days, hope still lingered. Police combed through every scenario that didn't involve violence. Teenagers leaving without telling anyone. It happened. Maybe they'd caught a ride. Maybe they'd gone to stay with friends. Maybe they just needed space. But as the hours stretched into days, that version of events began to feel less and less real. Because nothing about this disappearance made sense. They hadn't packed anything. No extra clothes, no plans, no messages left behind. And most of all, no one had seen them. Search teams pushed deeper into the bushland surrounding the campsite. Volunteers joined in. Friends, family, strangers, all moving through dense scrub and winding tracks, calling out their names into a silence that never answered back. The terrain itself worked against them. Thick forest, isolated trails, long stretches where a person could disappear and never be noticed. But even in a place like that, two girls don't just vanish, not without something, or someone, leaving a trace. As the investigation widened, police began speaking to everyone connected to that night. The group at the campsite, the friends at the party the girls were trying to reach, anyone who might have been on those roads, or in that forest, after dark. And slowly, small pieces began to surface. Not answers, but inconsistencies. There were reports of a vehicle in the area, unfamiliar, out of place, seen near the dirt tracks not long after Lauren and Nicole had left on foot. At first, it was just another lead, one of many, but as detectives pressed harder, that detail refused to fade, because if the girls had accepted a ride, then everything changed. The timeline tightened. The window between when they left the campsite and when they disappeared shrank to something terrifyingly small. Minutes, maybe less. Back at home, the families were still holding on to hope, but it was beginning to slip. Every unanswered call, every empty search, every night that passed without news, it all pointed in one direction. Something had gone wrong out there, very wrong, and somewhere, in that stretch of darkness between the campsite and the road ahead, Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins had crossed paths with someone who would make sure they never made it to that party. The question now wasn't whether they had been taken. It was, by who? 3 weeks. That's how long hope held on, before it began to fracture. By then, the search had turned up almost nothing. No footprints, no witnesses, no clear direction. Just one thing, a single piece of clothing, lying near a dirt track by the local rubbish tip. A surf jacket. Checked pattern. It belonged to Lauren. It should have been a breakthrough. Instead, it was a dead end. Forensic tests came back empty. No usable evidence. No clear indication of what had happened, or where the girls had gone. And with that, the search began to slow. For the families, it felt like the ground was giving way beneath them. Search teams packed up. The noise, the movement, the urgency, all of it faded. What replaced it was something colder. An investigation. Detectives shifted focus. Whiteboards filled with names, timelines, fragments of information that didn't quite fit together. 8, maybe 9 different lines of inquiry. Each one a possibility. Each one a long shot. And then a call came in from a small town hours away. Yass, Two names surfaced: Leslie Camilleri, Lindsay Beckett. Men who, according to local police, were more than capable of something like this. Not suspects yet, but not strangers to violence either. They moved together. Camilleri, the dominant one, controlling, experienced, a career criminal with a long history. Beckett, quieter, unstable, the kind of man who followed orders without question. A dangerous combination, and one that had just placed itself on the edge of this case. At first, it was just a feeling, a sense that something about them didn't sit right. Then, something more concrete emerged. An informant, a conversation. Camilleri reportedly reacting to news coverage, making an offhand remark that caught detectives' attention. Not denial, not surprise, but something else. Something that sounded almost like anticipation. I bet the cops try to pin this on us. For investigators, that wasn't just odd. It was telling, because people with nothing to hide don't usually think like that. So detectives moved. Fast. They tracked Beckett down first, brought him in, sat him across the table. And, from the beginning, something felt off. He was too relaxed, too comfortable, leaning back like none of this mattered, like this was just another conversation. But detectives weren't interested in his posture. They were waiting for the right moment, because there was one detail they hadn't mentioned yet. A strange, almost insignificant report from earlier in the investigation. A television, seen sitting on the side of a road the morning after the girls vanished. Pink, out of place, and then gone. At first, it meant nothing, but now it was everything. When they finally brought it up, Beckett changed, subtle but unmistakable. The ease disappeared. The answers stopped making sense. And just like that, the case shifted, because now detectives had something tangible. A thread. They followed it, tracked the origin of the television, a second-hand store, a record, a serial number, and then confirmation. It was pink. The same pink television seen near the road, the same road the girls would have taken. And somehow, it led straight back to Camilleri and Beckett. Now, they weren't just names on a board. They were in it. When police questioned Camilleri, they held that detail back again. Let him talk. Let him build his version of events. Vague, careful, controlled, until they dropped it, the television, and everything stopped. Silence, long enough to say everything he wouldn't. Then he shut down completely. No more answers, no more cooperation. But it was already too late, because back in his cell, away from the interview room, away from the pressure, Camilleri cracked. Not in words, but in behavior, banging his head against the wall, crying, repeating one thing over and over. They know about the television. For detectives, that was confirmation, not of what happened, but of who. Now they just needed the truth, and they knew exactly where to get it. Back in the interview room, they turned to the weaker link, Lindsay Beckett. This time, they didn't start with questions. They started with something else. 2 photographs. Lauren, Nicole, placed quietly in front of him. And for the first time, he couldn't look. The mask slipped, just for a second. But it was enough. Detectives leaned in, careful, measured. They told him what they knew. that they could place him there, that Camilleri wasn't protecting him, that this was his moment. A choice. Stay silent, or tell them what really happened. Beckett stepped out of the room for a cigarette, left the detectives alone with the weight of it all. Had they pushed enough? Had they gone too far? Or not far enough? Moments later, he came back, and everything was about to change. The moment came fast. Too fast. Detective Winterflood had barely finished speaking when Beckett reappeared, moving with purpose, cutting down the corridor like he'd already made the decision. He stepped into the room and didn't hesitate. "I'll show you where they are." Just like that, after weeks of silence, of not knowing, they finally had a direction. A map was spread out across the table. Beckett leaned over it, tracing the route with his finger, following the highway south, past towns, past borders, into isolation. Then he stopped, pointing. About here, nearly 200 kilometers from where the girls were last seen. Winterflood pressed him, carefully. He needed clarity. How did they die? Beckett didn't soften it, didn't look away. Their throats were cut. And who did it? A beat. Then, "I killed both." No emotion, no hesitation, just a statement. From that moment on, everything moved quickly. Beckett gave a full account, not just words, but actions. He took detectives back through it all, step by step. A road trip through evidence, stopping at points along the way, where knives had been thrown, where clothing had been burned, where pieces of the truth had been discarded. Hours later, they reached a place called Fiddler's Green Creek. Remote, dense, silent. The kind of place no one just stumbles upon. They left the vehicles and pushed into the bush, downward, through thick terrain, toward the water. And then, before they saw anything, they smelled it. A heavy, unmistakable presence in the air. Enough to tell them. They were close. At the base of a massive tree, its roots torn from the earth. They found her. Lauren. What remained of her was unmistakable. Still, silent, waiting. Just meters away, across the creek. They found Nicole. 2 lives, ended, hidden in a place no one would think to look. For weeks, their families had searched, hoped, prayed for answers. Now, they had them. But the truth that followed was worse than anyone imagined. Back in the interview room, Beckett began to lay it out. Not just what happened at the end, but everything that led there. The girls leaving the campsite, walking down that dirt track, a torch in the dark, a bottle in hand, 2 teenagers, thinking about a party, nothing more. Then, headlights, a car slowing down, 2 men inside. At first, just a conversation, something casual, something that didn't immediately feel dangerous. But the car was cluttered, packed, and while they talked, the men made space, pulling a television out, placing it by the road, moving things around, preparing. Because once the girls got in, they weren't getting out. The doors didn't work, not from the inside. What happened next unfolded over hours, long, relentless, moving from one isolated place to another. The car never staying still for long. At some point, control turned into violence, knives were produced, and whatever illusion of choice the girls had was gone. They were taken, held, and over the course of the night, subjected to repeated abuse. 9.5 hours, in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, with no one coming. As dawn approached, The car reached the final location, Fiddler's Green Creek. Beckett described it in pieces. Cold, detached, like he was recounting something ordinary. The girls were taken from the car, bound, separated. Lauren, restrained on the ground. Nicole, tied to a tree just meters away, close enough to hear, close enough to understand what was happening. Camilleri gave the instructions, clear, deliberate, and then he walked away. Beckett followed through, dragging Lauren into the shallow water beneath the fallen tree, holding her there, as she fought, as she tried to breathe, until she couldn't. Then he turned, climbed the embankment, approached Nicole from behind, and ended her life, where she stood. Two girls, minutes apart, in a place no one would hear them. Afterward, it was as if nothing had happened. They returned to the car, drove away, disposed of evidence, burned what they could, threw the knives into the water, and kept moving. Back to normal, at least. For them. For everyone else. Nothing would ever be normal again. With Beckett's confession, the case had finally broken open. But there was still one piece missing. Because while Beckett had admitted what he'd done, he hadn't acted alone. And now, detectives needed to hear it. From the man who had given the orders, back in custody. Leslie Camilleri was ready to talk, but the version of events he was about to give would try to shift everything and change where the blame fell. Camilleri's version was simple, too simple. He said he'd been asleep, unaware. That when Beckett returned to the car, covered in blood, he didn't question it, didn't understand it. Didn't take part in anything that had happened. It was a story built on distance. Distance from the violence. Distance from responsibility. Distance from the truth. But by then, detectives had already heard enough. Beckett had confessed. The bodies had been found. The timeline had been reconstructed. Both men were charged with murder. But proving it in court, that was a different battle entirely. Because Beckett had admitted what he'd done, Camilleri hadn't. And more importantly, he hadn't been physically present at the moment the girls were killed. That single fact would become the center of everything. In August 1998, the case moved into court. Two men, two very different strategies. Beckett pleaded guilty. No fight, no denial, just acceptance. And when the judge laid out what had been done, even in a courtroom that had seen its share of violence, it landed heavily. The details were described as some of the most confronting ever heard. Not because of how graphic they were, but because of what they represented. A complete absence of restraint, of mercy, of humanity. Beckett was sentenced. Life, with a minimum of 35 years. But his role wasn't over, because now he would become the key witness. Everything hinged on whether the court believed him, whether his account could tie Camilleri, not just to the events, but to the intent behind them. Camilleri's defense leaned hard in the opposite direction. They painted a different picture, one of a man impaired, disconnected, half-conscious from drug use, present, but not involved, aware, but not responsible, and legally. That mattered. A lot. Because if Camilleri didn't carry out the killings, the prosecution had to prove something else. Control, influence, direction. That Beckett hadn't acted alone, but had acted under instruction. And that's not easy to prove. Not without something solid. Something that couldn't be explained away. That's where the evidence came in. Quiet. Precise. Unarguable. A trace. found on Lauren's clothing, small enough to miss, but powerful enough to change everything. It tied Camilleri directly to the assault, placed him in the chain of events, confirmed that Beckett's story wasn't just a story, but it didn't stop there, because, buried in police records, there was something else, an earlier incident, 2 weeks before the murders. A woman, picked up by the same two men, taken in the same car, doors that wouldn't open, knives, isolation. She survived, barely, escaping into the bush, hiding, running until she found help. At the time, she disappeared before the case could go further. But now, detectives found her, and this time, she spoke. Her account mirrored everything: the method, the control, the escalation. It wasn't just evidence, it was a pattern. And, in court, that pattern mattered because it showed intent. It showed capability. It showed that what happened to Lauren and Nicole wasn't random for the families. The trial was something else entirely. Every detail, every moment, replayed, out loud, in front of them, for Lauren's brother, for their friends. It wasn't just testimony, it was reliving it, word by word, second by second, feeling it all over again. And then there was Camilleri, sitting there, watching, no remorse and no reaction, just presence for those in the room. That was its own kind of cruelty. Weeks passed. Witnesses spoke. Evidence stacked. The picture became clearer, darker, harder to ignore. And then, in April 1999, the verdict came. Guilty. On both counts. The judge didn't hold back. He described Camilleri as the embodiment of fear itself, the kind that follows people into the dark, the kind that changes how the world feels, forever. The sentence reflected that. Life, no parole. He would never walk free again. Years later, another truth surfaced, another life taken before Lauren and Nicole. Another reminder that this hadn't started with them, and for Beckett, the same fate, a life behind bars, with decades before even the possibility of release. But for the families, no sentence was enough, because nothing could balance it, nothing could return what was lost. There's a moment, in cases like this, where people search for meaning, for logic, for something that explains how it all came together. But sometimes there isn't one. Two girls walking down a road, at night, towards something ordinary, and at that exact moment, a car appears. If they had left earlier, if they had waited longer, if one small thing had changed, maybe they keep walking. Maybe they make it to that party. Maybe they grow up, have lives, stories, futures, but they didn't, because on that night, in that place, they crossed paths with the worst kind of people. And in the end, that's what makes this case so haunting. Not just what was done, but how close they came to everything being different. For the detectives, this case didn't fade with time. They had seen murder before. They had worked scenes, followed leads, delivered news no one ever wants to hear. But this one stayed with them, not just because of what happened, but because of how long it happened for. The hours, the suffering, the knowledge that those two girls were out there, in that car, waiting, hoping, and no one came. For many of them, it became personal. They had daughters, families, lives that suddenly felt more fragile than they had ever imagined. Because once you understand what happened here, you don't just see a case, You see possibilities. You see what could happen. To anyone. And that's the part that never really leaves. For the people who knew Lauren and Nicole, the weight was different, but just as heavy. Guilt. The kind that doesn't make sense, but refuses to go away. The last conversations. The small decisions. The moments that felt ordinary at the time, but now feel like turning points. A missed chance, a different choice. A feeling, ignored, and the question that follows. What if? What if they had said something? What if they had stopped them? What if they had just been there? 10 minutes earlier. It's a loop that never really ends. For Sarah. It became something she carried into every part of her life. Even the simple things. Getting out of bed. Being present. Feeling whole. Because a part of her stayed back there. On that night. In that moment. And despite everything. Despite the years. Despite the distance. Lauren and Nicole never left her. Not a day goes by. Years later, there was one place she had never been. Fiddler's Green Creek, the place where it ended. In March of 2017, she went, with Nathan. The walk in wasn't easy. Dense bush, uneven ground, a silence that pressed in from every direction. Beautiful. In a way the Australian landscape often is. Calm, still. But underneath that, something else. Because once you know what happened there, the beauty doesn't feel the same. Every step becomes heavier, every sound sharper, and you begin to understand just how far the girls were taken, how isolated they were, how impossible it would have been to find a way out. Standing there, it changed something, not the facts, not the outcome, but the reality of it. It filled in the last space, the part that had only existed in imagination. Now, it was real, and with that reality came something else, a message. Because in the aftermath of cases like this, there's always noise, judgment, questions about what the victims did or didn't do, what they should have done differently, where they shouldn't have gone, what they should have known. But that thinking misses the point entirely, because responsibility doesn't sit with the victims. It never did. It sits with the people who made the choice. To harm, to control, to destroy. And shifting that blame only hides the truth. If there's any legacy to take from this, it's that, and maybe something more. A reminder of how much we rely on each other, of how fragile that connection can be, and how important it is to hold on to it, to look out for one another, to care, to show up, because in the end, that's what remains for those left behind. There is no closure. Not really. There's memory. There's love, and there's the quiet, constant effort to keep going, to live in a world that feels different now, a world where two girls left a campsite one night and never came back, and where the echo of that night still hasn't faded.